You know, when they chose a patron, first of all, it's not just we were happy Francis was the obvious choice of a patron for ecology, but the fact that we didn't see a need for a patron till the middle half of the 20th century, or the late part of the 20th century, is because we didn't see in holes. Now, the medieval Franciscans used a different metaphor. They called it the great chain of being. So there was that connection. But I'm going to refer to something I said in the previous talk, that I really do think the single biggest heresy that allows us to misinterpret the scriptural tradition, the New Testament in particular, is individualism. And this is revealed in the whole problem we are now facing with the earth, with earth care, with sustainability, with animals dying off one after the other. That, you know, Jesus says, he who does not gather with me scatters. Well, I think we've done a lot of scattering. And we've done a lot of splitting. Instead of expanding the notion of God's salvation, and that's given to us very clearly in the Hebrew Scriptures. If you go back, once you say it to people, they say, yeah. You know, all of God's engagements are with the social corporate thing, not with the individual. He's saving Israel. The covenant is with Israel, the people, history itself. And that we whittle that down into how can I go to heaven is really first-rate heresy. But it reflects the lack of the mystical level, where mysticism is always about more and more connecting. The more you can connect, the more mystical you really are. The more you realize you're participating in something and you're just a part of the bigger mystery. Well, we whittled it down to, first of all, God just seemed to care about humans. And then once we whittled it down that much, it was just a small percentage of humans. Really, it's sort of, if we follow our own rules, the way most denominations interpreted the gospel, very few people are going to enjoy eternal life with God. God isn't saving history. God isn't saving the corporate. God's saving a few evangelicals or a few Roman Catholics or whatever your group might be. But I don't want to spend time on that. We also became so anthropocentric that all God cared about was not the new heaven and the new earth, but just us, and as I said, not very many of us. That's what happens when you go down the track of individualism and lose the mystical level of perception. So the big loser, of course, were not just whoever was not Christian, but the animals. I mean, I don't want to offend anybody who's a hunter, but that a Christian would think killing animals for sport was high-level anything. Is sort of unthinkable, but we took it for granted. I'm sure popes went out hunting, you know, killing animals, not because they needed them, just to show that I'm stronger than you or more skilled than you and I can kill you. Once you've got to the higher level, you can't think that way anymore because you've connected, and you've honored the subjectivity, the mutuality of other things. Now, one reason, of course, they chose Francis as the patron of ecology. He's the first recorded person. There might have been others, there surely must have been, but he's the first recorded Western Christian who granted animals and elements and planets subjectivity, respect, and mutuality by calling them brother and sister. Now, that's no small thing. That means you've had a contemplative honoring of them in your real life that you've seen. You know, I'm giving to them, but they're giving back to me. Like my little dog Venus here. You know, when she makes eye contact with me, I do often feel like, and she holds it. She can hold it longer than I can. She'll just look at me adoringly for 10 minutes. And I say, what is going on there? What is going on that she is so fascinated and loyal to my being, which pulls a kind of fascination and loyalty out of me toward her. That's a participatory universe. And Francis expresses it with wind, with fire, with brother sun, sister moon. The whole universe is a participatory experience. That is where high level any religion leads you. It doesn't just have to be Christianity. But what I want to say is that you'd think Christianity would have gotten there real early and first, because we're the only religion that concretely believes that the divine took on flesh. No one else claims the divine became a human being. We call it the mystery of incarnation. And yet to play with that word, much of our history has been excarnation. How can we get out of the world? Brian McLaren, I think he might be a part of your series. We're good friends. And he says, we made the gospel into an evacuation plan for the next world. How can we get out of this earth, off this earth, out of this world? This whole beautiful world, even our desert world of New Mexico, it was just a backdrop for our little dramas, our little human dramas. We didn't experience our inherent reliance upon this. None of us could live without sister water here. None of us. Life does not exist without sister water. And yet sister water, that was Francis's term for water, didn't seem to deserve respect. We could pollute it. So my point is, we didn't get incarnation, which we claimed was our big deal. And we didn't get it at all, except in a very, very narrow sense. And now we're paying the price for it. The huge dying off of species every day, the polluting of the earth. Just yesterday here in our own city, pollution flowed into the Rio Grande because of a recent flood. Sewage flowed into the Rio Grande. How is it that things like that continue to happen among people who consider themselves so civilized? But it's everything else was beneath us. We alone were being saved. We alone were being loved. And so we lost any sense of ecosystem. We've been saying lately that cosmology is the new name for theology. That now, like no other generation, we know the extent of the mystery of the universe. And I'm sure we haven't begun. But we can give a date, 14.6 billion years, that this universe has been expanding. My gosh. Of course, the mind just closes down. It can't think of that anymore, And that 99.9% of it is emptiness, is silence, is space, and darkness. All of the things we avoid and run from and deny as important, that God created a universe that is mostly dark, empty, silent space. Does that have anything to teach consciousness? Well, as a teacher of contemplation, it's front and center. That until you can honor silence, you don't know how to interpret the particles inside of the space. They have no meaning except inside of the relationship between them. So it's very exciting to live in this time, even though it's very sad to see how much time we've missed in not honoring literally the earth on which we stand, from which Mother Earth, Francis called her Sister Mother Earth, very interesting, Sister Mother Earth. None of us would be sitting here right now. We would not have had food to feed these bodies, water to hydrate these bodies. So you almost wonder if the one thing we absolutely all share in common, I don't care if you're a Hindu, a Confucian, a Stone Age person, a so-called barbarian, a Persian, a Mayan, we've all stood on this same earth. And we've all looked up at this same brother, sun, sister, moon. That we've all shared in common. Could it be, is it possible, that the mystery is already encapsulated there. I believe so. And that's why the early Franciscans called creation the first Bible. Right? This is the first Bible. And if you murder and mangle and manipulate and do not attend to or respect the first Bible, the assumption was you would murder and mangle and manipulate the second Bible. Does that need much proof? What we've done with the Bible? Because you could make the case, and I'm a teacher of the Bible, but you could make the case that the Bible has done as much damage in human history as it has good. And let me draw it together on that one. You know, when we want a quote to serve our purposes, we find it. And of course, you can find whatever you want in a line from the Bible. And that one darn line in Genesis, where it was translated at least, you are to dominate over the earth. Probably would have been better translated steward or care for. But in most historic translations, you are to subdue the earth. Boy, we got a lot of mileage out of that. That we were the subduers and everything else was to be subdued. To the patriarchal mind, that made total sense. That's the way we saw everything. The conquistadors that came here to New Mexico, Spanish Catholics. It was not to reverence the local people or the local ecology, but it was to subdue it. So I'm afraid we're going to pay a price for this for centuries to come. Our immense capacity for missing the point. But after saying that, I can't give up on religion. Yes, religion became much of the problem, but it is still the spiritual heart of the answer because it grants inherent sacrality, inherent holiness, goodness, value, worthiness, use whatever word you want, to the material world. And no religion does that better, in theory, than Christianity. Grants inherent sacrality to materiality, physicality. But again, we individualized it, we pulled it into our private little human selves, and we didn't have the mature eyes that could see it's not only I who have materiality, but my dog here, Venus, she has it. And those trees out the window, they have it. They share in this same material universe that I share. And so that's a very brief foundation of what I'm going to call eco-spirituality. And it's a good foundation because there's basically nothing to argue about. The physical world works the same in China as it does here. Absolutely the same. And to say there's two different truths, no, it's the same truth. And those who have eyes to see in China will see what we have eyes to see in America. You can't get much better than that. It creates a truly global spirituality, which finally humanity is really capable of. Not just capable of, but if we don't get it, we're in trouble. So, let's move from there.
I'm holding myself back from answering numerous questions, trusting that I know you folks are ready with questions and thoughts and reactions to what you've just heard. So please jump in. This is going to be a lively conversation again.
Well, to echo the crowds in Acts of the Apostles, to Peter's question, what are we to do?
Boy, a lot of it initially, I talked in the earlier session about not being a problem-solving religion. But now I'm going to go back on that because a lot of it right now is problem-solving, mopping up exercises, undoing bad theology, undoing bad spirituality. In fact, a lot of us have been saying in recent years that much of our teaching is unlearning, not learning. Now that becomes a great learning. And that's why I resort to the teaching of contemplation so much, because contemplation in practice is a daily exercise in self-emptying, in detaching, in unlearning your learned patterns. Now, people who don't want to unlearn, but see religion as ideology, and the ideology, I define ideology as when you already have your answers, Don't bother me with reality or the facts or anything else. My answers are already in place. That very worldview is so much of what we have to undo. To grant a kind of humility to religion again, because it hasn't been very humble up to now, I'm afraid.
So, Richard, I'd like to understand a little bit better about, I'm torn between the mopping up versus the mindset. St. Francis, obviously, you know, if we go along with what you're saying, the historical context of it, I think that is more amenable to a global view. And because if we get into the mopping up, I think it's just a vicious cycle. And I don't want to be too specific, but I will.
That's a good point.
The oil spill and then the British Petroleum and that whole thing, that's what comes to mind whenever you say mopping up. And so I think that just buys into, we're
Gotcha.
fixing the problem they generated as opposed to St. Francis, and do we really look at the wind and say, you know, brother, sister. So I'd like a little more input from you on that.
You know, the only thing that inspires the soul is what Ken Wilber calls vision logic. You need a great big positive vision to seduce the soul out and
Yes.
forward. And you're absolutely right. Problem solving does not do that, because it gets used to problem solving and it needs another problem to get motivated. And I bet we all see that in ourselves, you know, that we actually, I need something to be wrong today to get my juices going.
Yes.
And to simply operate out of pure praise, glory, love, that's a higher level of motivation, but one that doesn't easily come our way. Now, I think that's why worship was so idealized in the Christian world. Ideally, worship was coming together for no other reason except praise and glory. To thank God. But what did we do? We gave fire and brimstone sermons against those Protestants or something. You understand? Because now we have a problem to solve. Now we have something to deal with. Or homosexuals, or whoever the problem is. We've got to create a problem. So thank you for saying it. That we would do well to emphasize the positive, the vision logic, an optimistic worldview. And I think you're right on. That's why Francis is probably, hands down, the most popular saint, because he comes across so positive. You know, it's like he isn't moralistic. He isn't concerned about eliminating anybody. You know, it's just this joyous worldview where he runs through the fields playing two sticks like they're a violin. You know, maybe we all don't need to be that way, but we do need something to be for, much more than something to be against. Thank you.
Yeah.
But you know, isn't part of our failure to recognize our relationship to the earth and the elements and the animals that populate the earth probably maybe coming from our view that we know everything, so we don't have to look, we don't have to observe nature, we don't have to interact with nature because we have all the answers. So we don't have to learn from Venus or other creatures that come into our life, or what happens to our waters, and because we have all the answers.
That's the hubris or the arrogance of post-Enlightenment human beings. The real conviction that we had it all, we understood it all. We call that modernism. And of course now we live in a postmodern age precisely because modernism showed itself not to be true. It produced 2 world wars. So these are the people who know everything, and it came from the continent who had the most universities and the most educated people and the most churches and the most Christians of any continent. Now we're the children of that continent too, so I'm not picking on them. But modernism got utterly humbled, and yet we haven't learned the lessons of that Still. Instead, we slipped into postmodernism, which is universal cynicism about everything. Everything. There are no answers. And most of our children live and grow up in that postmodern world. But what you still have, thank God, is an understanding that no, it's not cynicism about everything, but the incarnation, in fact, is saying God is in everything, even in its wounded state. Wow, that's good stuff.
Well, part of what I found is that when I'm in nature, and my wife and I spend about 2 weeks to 3 weeks every year hiking in the Rockies,
Wow.
is that to be that surrounded by the reality of nature instills a sense of awe, that you know, the sublime reality that we are only a species on the planet, and we're not necessarily here forever. That, you know, species have been eradicated in the past, and we contribute to the eradication of species in the present. And this whole sense that God is present everywhere in the incarnation of the creation.
Yes. You know, once you say it, it's so common sense. It doesn't even need proof, I don't think. It's just, as you just open your eyes. That ability to see things that way is what we mean by contemplation. It's this open-eyed reverencing of reality as it is, without a label, without a functional purpose. It already has value in itself. And, you know, we had a conference here a few years ago just on nature and the human soul. And I don't know how many hundreds we had to turn away from it. And we still had almost 1,500 attending. Because people just intuitively know this is true, what you just said. That the Rocky Mountains are a cathedral, all right? Mm-hmm. And if you can't experience universal connection and reverence and awe and your own littleness, you don't need a sermon on being humble. You know, you know you're nothing. I walk into some of these big canyons here in New Mexico, the rock, and, you know, it was here long before me. It's going to be here long after me. And I'm walking through it this day. And who am I to think that I name it? Maybe it's naming me too. That's contemplative seeing. That's why, you know, our center started, Center for Action and Contemplation. But as the years went on, we still appeal to people who are working for social change. But it's largely teaching the contemplative mind. Because until that mind that you're referring to emerges, nothing changes. Nothing. Everything is functional, pragmatic, utilitarian, and not inherently sacred. Let me just build on that because I want to but honor that word evolution. You would have thought, if we had understood incarnation, Christians should have been on the front lines of understanding evolution. Because grace is inherent to creation. If God created it, we're the ones who believe God created all things. We all assent to that. And yet grace was still extrinsic to the universe. So evolution was not in our natural understanding. I'm writing a book right now on Franciscan mysticism, and that's its touchstone. He took incarnation to its logical conclusions. And that was what made us sort of a subtext, a minority position inside the church. Because even mainline Catholicism, even though it was sacramental and supposedly saw the physical world as a doorway to the spiritual world, by and large, most Catholics also saw grace as extrinsic to the universe. God, who occasionally visited and gave you grace. You understand? Mm-hmm. But the light didn't shine from inside. So that's why we weren't prepared for evolution and even fought it. I mean, is it the majority of Christians today still do not believe in evolution? Mm-hmm. Breaks your heart. Sort of unbelievable. Yeah.
Well, the problem is everything you're saying is so spot on and so nurturing that I just want to hear more. And I'm not flattering you. I really am just kind of speechless. The dilemma I see in all of this is that to get what you're talking about entails a real transformation of consciousness. And I'm a parish priest, and I love the notion of the transformation of consciousness, but actually running a parish and seeing that actually happen in a parish. Well, you're still doing it. I'm no longer running a parish, but Raymond, you're still the leader of a parish. I mean, everything you're saying is absolutely spot on. How do you get this across? Yeah. Going back to the earlier conversation, the quid pro quo, I'll believe about the environment what is beneficial to my economic existence. Yes. I don't believe in global warming because I have so many shares in Exxon. Mm-hmm. You know, and if you're, and let me tell you something, if you're a parish priest in the Woodlands, Texas, you know, they're going to hear that. How do you actually get people to calm down enough to embrace what contemplation really is, to undergo the transformation of consciousness, which enables them to look at Venus and say, this is a fellow creature, not my dog?
Yeah. You know, what you're pointing toward, and this is what we're facing in what we're calling emerging Christianity, is that the very evolution of consciousness that is taking place among a significant is showing the insufficiency of the present vehicles we have for the vision. The present church, parish, neighbor, corner church structure gathers people who are still at the magical level, still at the mythical level, still at the rational level, and still at the pluralistic level, which is, we're glad they're at least that far. But we need structures that, in fact, encourage people at the mystical level, because that's the level Jesus is at. And if you want to understand Jesus, you've just got to at least have an openness to it, or you pull him down into what I call dualistic thinking, which is what we've largely done. That's the magical, mythical level. It's all dualistic thinking, either or. Is it for me or against me? It's all self-referential, to quote Pope Francis. He loves that word. He keeps telling the clergy they're all self-referential, and that the church is self-referential. And he says that's not the gospel. If it's self-referential, it's not the gospel. Mm-hmm. He has a way of saying things that just gets right to the point. So, I mean, I'm not a parish priest, although I have Mass here on the corner each Sunday when they need me. But I see that the very expectation, and this is a poor Mexican-American lower middle class parish, that they come with, and they're dear, simple, open-hearted people for the most part. But the expectation they come with is not to be changed. It's to be told, again, what they already agree with.
They're looking for confirmation, right?
Yeah, confirmation.
That's the word. Mm-hmm.
And so the structure itself doesn't lend itself to transformation. So that's why we're calling parachurch phenomenon emerging church. That you need these groups along the edge. The last 2 years before I stopped traveling, I preached in so many Episcopal cathedrals around the country because I'd given these rectors a retreat. So they started inviting me to their cathedrals. And I must say I was impressed. I didn't expect to be. My Catholic prejudice said, oh, these are going to be all fat cat Anglicans, you know. Well, it wasn't true. I mean, these were people who were amazingly aware. You know? And again, they were putting a lot of their concern into these the Thursday morning Bible study group, the Wednesday night contemplative prayer group. But they didn't throw out the Sunday morning gathering. They still knew this is a place to gather and not scatter, but they knew that wasn't where the future was at. Again and again I saw that. The future wasn't in the large congregation, because it doesn't come with an expectation of transformation, grace, growth. It doesn't come with what we call here beginner's mind. And you have to teach people beginner's mind. That's contemplation.
I have become personally very weary of anxiety about the future of the church. I mean, all the anxiety does is make it difficult for me to think, and I've never seen that anything really good comes out of it. But so I've kind of a two-part question. One is this: expand a little bit on the future's not in the large church, but then also I have subscriptions to Shambhala magazine, to Dharma. And I go this whole, and these are very slick productions. I mean, these are high quality, superlative magazines. It's obvious that a lot of people are reading them for them to simply be able to do what they do. So when I hear people talk about the quote-unquote unchurched on the premise that they're not coming to church because they're too lazy to, or something to that effect, my experience is when I read Yoga Journal and think about the people that actually take this seriously, they're exercising a lot more discipline than most people I see in church on Sunday mornings. And that goes to the consciousness issue. So I don't know what you're going to do with everything I just said, but I look forward to finding out.
Well, you know, a principle that I quote a lot from Ken Wilber, and I just have found to be true, again, Francis taught us this, it's a two-word principle he calls transcend and include. And then I add to that when I can, if you have transcended, authentic, you can include. So you can still do the Sunday morning service with joy, with freedom, with those are children of God who are on the journey. And I can include them. They don't have to be at the mystical level yet. Who of us, how long did it take us to grow up, you know? And that was Francis's big principle, you know. The Catholic Church was the only game in town in the 13th century Italy, you know. So he found a way to survive inside of it, but did it very differently. Moved literally outside the walls of Assisi, if you've ever been there. The two little churches he rebuilt are still standing. But he didn't fight the bishop and the priests inside the wall. Go ahead. And there's evidence he would still go to these churches, you know, on feast days and occasions. But he did it differently. So we've summed that up in one of the principles here at the center, that the best criticism of the bad is the practice of the better. That go ahead and do it better yourself. So, you know, I just got Shambhala today. That's funny you'd mention it. And the head on the magazine, the heading is spiritual but not religious. They're going to tackle that whole theme in the most recent issue because that's what half of America says. Mm-hmm. But I think you're right. I mean, I meet these spiritual but not religious people at totally secular gatherings talking about finance, talking about, you understand? Sometimes who are more willing to be engaged on God questions than the typical Sunday morning parishioner who doesn't want to talk about God at all. And that's just being honest. And I've been a priest long enough, 43 years now, I think I've earned the right to say that we gotta, I'm not trying to put down my church, but we've created a high degree of very passive people who are not comfortable praying from the heart, who are not comfortable talking about grace from their heart. And I meet people at secular gatherings who are. It blows my mind. It's now, you know what Jesus meant when he said, you know, the children of this world are sometimes wiser in their ways than the children of light, so-called. It's true. It's just true. Thank you.